Okay, welcome to part 4 of my little dice application tour, and we talked about the create, event, object button roll and setting a few variables. Now here's where the guts of it is really. We press on the dice roll object button and we roll the dice. So just a quick tour of this. I've commented this out so you can always refer to it if you get the URL for the source file, and if you haven't got the URL for the source file, here it is here. I'll click on game information, and at the very bottom you'll see here's where you can download the source file from. Got that, www.osat.co.nz/pub/dice-roll.gm81. Okay, having done that, you'll see that here's where the real action starts to happen. So we pressed on the dice, on the roll of the dice, and we've changed the sprite back into tumble red. And the reason we've done that is because up till now you've always seen it as being that this particular sprite as being tumble red, but if it's the second loop of this and it's the second roll, at some stage we've actually changed that from tumble red, that sprite, into actually sprite red, so we can show the results. So I'm changing it back again now because we rolled again. We want it to turn back into the animated dice, and there's two instances of that, and that is for the red dice and the blue dice. Okay, so we're going to roll the dice in a random left to right direction between 45 degrees and minus 45 degrees. Now we want to simulate the dice being thrown by the hand from the left hand side to the right hand side. So what I'm going to do here is set direction and speed of motion. That's very easy. That's a little icon here. You drag it in and we set the direction and speed of motion. If you see here, I've got a calculation here. I'm applying it to another object, that's dice rolling 1. I've got a little calculation here which picks a number between 0 and 90, and we subtract 45 from it because 0 degrees is east or left, and I want to throw the dice in a 45 degree fashion, in a random 45 degree fashion between plus 45 degrees, which is northeast, and minus 45 degrees, which is southeast. So, and I'm going to still do that at the 18 speed because I want the dice to be thrown fairly hard, but as you can see from the timeline that's coming up shortly, I'm decreasing that fairly quickly. Okay, so those are those two set directions, left and right. Okay, we want to make the rolling dice visible. Remember I said they were invisible before, and they were invisible for a reason, because when we started the game we didn't want to show them on their edge, which was that tumble sort of sprite. So now we're going to make both of them visible, and it's pretty simple. It's a property of that of the dice object, and as you can see here, it's another object rolling dice 2, and we want to make the variable that's visible, which is, as I said, is a property of that built-in property of that object, and we want to make it 1, which is true. Okay, so we've now rolled the dice because we clicked on the roll the dice. So I want to increment the lives value, which is the roll count, in fact, because as I said before, I've hijacked that score thing, and I'm going to increment that by 1, and so that means because we've clicked on roll, we're going to make the roll count plus 1. Now I'm going to play the little sound, the roll sound, which is the dice hitting on sort of a glass surface, which is fine in this example. And before you can do that, you have to actually, of course, create the sound, which you see here is sound roll, and sound roll relates to a sound that I loaded, and I grabbed that from the internet. So we're going to play that sound roll, and you'll see here the comment is start this timeline. Remember, I initiated the timeline before on the create event, and now I'm going to set it to actually start running. I'm going to start from position 0, which is frame 0, which is dependent on the room speed. That's going to be the very first frame. I don't want it to loop, and I want it to start immediately because I've now pressed the dice count. Okay, now for the interesting stuff, even more interesting stuff should I say, is that's all that's to do with the left press button. So what I want to do now is look at what actually controls the rest of the actions, which is this timeline that I talked about before. So I click on my timeline, and you can see here I created this timeline before and we saw all that part there. What I've done is I've actually divided that timeline up, and I've divided them up into steps. Welcome to my part 4 of this quick little tour of my dice application. Hasn't turned out to be so quick in terms of the YouTube examples, but and I'm sure I could have done a lot better at making it quicker. But anyway, we were talking about the timelines, and here it is. Remember, we created that dice rolling timeline, and this is what controls pretty much what happens in the game. Now, what I want to do here is have the dice roll. Remember, I did that from the object button roll, and here it was, and I set this score, and I set the when the left was pressed, I set the sound to play because I wanted it to make a noise when the dice rolled, and I set the timeline to dice rolling. And I set it to start now because we paused it originally when the game started. So back into my timeline. Started this timeline initially, you only saw this bit here, but now what I've done is I've divided it up into steps. Now the room speed, if you remember correctly, is 30, and what that means is that there'll be 30 frames every second. So things will happen at 30 frames per second. That means the dice animation will happen at 30 frames per second, the dice movement will happen at 30 frames per second, and everything will happen at 30 frames per second, including my timer here. So at step 5, remember step 1 at 30 frames per second is 0.002 of a second. So at 30 frames per second, that means that, you know, normally there'd be 60 frames per second if there was a 60th of a second, but at step 5 that means we're actually at 5 times 2, which is 0.1 of a second. It's a tenth of a second. So a tenth of a second, I'm going to slow the variable speed, image speed, to 10. So I'm going to set that variable, obviously relating to object dice rolling 1, and I'm going to set it to 10. Remember it started at 18, so I'm going to quickly start slowing that dice down according to Newton's laws of physics. So, you know, we're talking about inertia and friction and all those sort of things that have effect on the dice, so I'm immediately going to slow it down. So that's what happens at step 5, which, as I said, was a tenth of a second. Step 10, which is a 20th of a second, I'm going to slow it down even further. I'm going to slow down the image speed to 9, the variable image speed to 9, and the speed to 9. So that's the speed is how fast the dice are going. The image speed is how fast the dice are animating, which means how fast they're rolling, how fast that little tumbling effect has. And it's the same for all of these. We've got at 15 I'm slowing it down to 8, at 20 I'm slowing it down to 7, and so forth, all through step 25, step 30, step 35, step 45, and finally at step 50 you can see that I've actually stopped the dice from rolling. I've stopped it from animating, which is the image speed, and I've stopped it from rolling, which is the speed. Those are both properties of that dice roll object. Step 60 is where everything interesting happens, and what I'm going to say is, because I've stopped them from rolling, we don't want them to sit on an edge, so now I'm going to change that sprite, which was the dice rolling sprite, and I'm going to change it back into my sprite dice 6 red, which is, if you remember correctly, I'll show you what it is. It is the dice actually settled and showing a number. So I'm going to make the dice fall and actually reveal a number. And if I show you what that number is, you can't really tell because I've got a calculation in here, and my calculation is floor. First of all, we look at random 6, which is the I'm picking a random number between 0 and 6, and that can be 0.1 or it could be 5.999. It can't be 6 because it's between 0 and 6. And remember that my sub-images are from 0 to 5, which is 6 different numbers. So I'm going to pick one of those 6 different numbers at random, and the floor part here is because my random function will return a decimal, so it could return 5.99999, and it also could return 0.00001. What the floor part does is it rounds it down to an integer. And, for those of you who know anything about programming, integers are just real numbers and without decimal places. So my sub-image can be now something from 0. It can either be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can't be 6. But that corresponds exactly to my sub-images, which there's 6 of them. 0 is one of them. 1 is the second one. 2 is the third one. 3 is the fourth one. 5 is the fifth one, and 6 is the sixth one. So, and I also want to change the speed now because this dice is now settled and rolled, and I don't want it to start animating again. So there we go. And I've done that with both of the dice, and this is the bit that actually, because of that little random number thing that I generated, this is the bit that actually decides what dice roll I've thrown. And both of them apply to the red and blue dice. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the variable result on the dice rolling 1 to another object dice rolling 1, and I'm going to make the variable result. So what I'm actually doing here is creating and setting another property within that dice roll, and that will be useful because I can then reference that in a minute. This is not a built-in property because this is result. This is not one of the standard built-in properties of that variable, like image or image index or speed or anything like that. This is a new one that I'm setting called result, but that's going to attach to that object and become a property. And the value of it is going to be the image index, which remember we determined by a random number between 1 and 5. And I'm going to add +1 to it because it was a random object between 1 and 5 that was 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but dice don't have a 0, so I'm going to add 1 to it, so it now becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and one of those random numbers in between that. Do the same for the blue dice, and then we add up the two dice scores. So I'm going to set the score. Remember, that was the score I'd hijacked as the current throw total, and because I'd set these variables up here, I can now reference the variable for the object dice rolling 1 and the result. Remember, I set that result as a property of it, and I'm going to also look at the dice rolling 2 result, which was set here. And so now I reference those two properties and add them together, and that's how I set the score. Okay, now we update the running total, which remember I hijacked the health to do that, and so I set my variable, which, as I said, this is not absolutely necessary, but I set my variable global score to score. And you'll see that I've actually ticked relative on that, so that means my total score, which is I've hijacked as the health, is the total dice roll plus whatever I had rolled before. So it's a running total. Oops, I was hoping I could actually finish this within 4 videos, but obviously I can't, and I'm nearly finished, so bear with me and move on to my part 5. That would be great.